can just start by like each of you kind of going around the table and just giving a little bit in introduction about yourself and a little bit about the project so that the audience has some context and then we can move from there.
Hey everyone, my name is LaBonte. I lead enterprise solutions for LayerZero Labs, building out the LayerZero protocol. And yeah, so my background, a reformed engineer, now I'm more on the technical sales side. But yeah, hardware, was at MetaMask previously, and now on the infrastructure side. So great to meet everybody.
My name is Ramachandran. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Router Protocol. We've been in the interoperability space. We've been around for a while. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Happy to be in the panel.
I'm John. I'm the co-founder of protocol called Hyperlane. What Hyperlane is an open framework for interoperability. Think of it as the toolkit that lets anyone connect any chain, kind of across ecosystems, different VMs. Going on year 7 in crypto. Before starting this, I used to run the investment team at Galaxy and have been around for a little while and happy to chat today.
Hi, my name is Sankha. I'm like the chief protocol economist at Babylon. So we are a Bitcoin staking protocol.
Okay, let's get started. Maybe each of you can give one hot take regarding the current industry landscape, what you think most people believe, but maybe it's not true. Any controversial takes are very much welcome.
I got you right now, because there was something that you guys were talking about at the panel right before that I was surprised no one brought up. And so I think a lot of us, I used to say this, and I still to some extent say things like fragmentation is a massive problem and we're going to work to solve it. And I guess my hot take on this is no one is incentivized to solve it, actually, right? Because if you think of who is the direct customer you're solving for in this, it's the chain and it's the apps on the chain. And they don't want anyone to leave, right? So we work with tons of independent chains. And a question that we get more often than not is, can we actually have people just come in? Can you just let them just come in? What about don't worry about the leaving part. We don't really want the leaving part. And so the direct customer is, again, for a anti-fragmentation problem, for a anti-fragmentation product, is a chain. And inherently, again, if you speak to these chains, they want more assets, more activity there. They don't want anything that would take away from that. They don't want anything that would siphon that. And so I find that it's very counterintuitive, right? Like all of us want to work in service of the end user that obviously is better served off in a less fragmented world, but our actual customer, the one that needs to make the business decision to use this tool in the first place, they have zero or sometimes even negative incentive away from something like this. So that's my one hot take on this topic, and I got another that's also related to something from the previous panel.
So you want a hot take related to interoperability or in general?
Whatever.
Hot take on life.
One of the big takeaways of the last few days have been, in this market, nobody cares about your product. I mean, it's all about the community, the memes. I mean, I met this QOL and I came away depressed. You guys have a great product, but I mean, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, you need a meme. Who's your QOL? You need this. And those are the sort of conversations I'm hearing. And I'm sort of, especially in a bull market, right? When you want, maybe it's part of the package. You really want people to sort of appreciate what you're building and the nuances of, LayerZero versus Avail versus, router versus Hyperlane and so on and so forth. But especially in a bull market, a lot of the conversation paradoxically is sort of depressing, if you will. But I guess, that's been my big learning the last 3 or 4 days. But, otherwise, from an interoperability perspective, I sort of agree with John, which is, fragmentation is a huge problem, and and it's going to be a big problem for a while.
Yeah. I mean, see, in general, so I was in this panel before, and there's this question regarding similar to something what you said, right? But the idea was, ideally, what should have happened? This whole industry should have been, created by maybe 200 academics or implementers sitting in a private space and building all of this stuff up. But unfortunately, what has also happened, or fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which side of the spectrum you are, is this industry is incredibly financialized, right? Like, and so it leads to the right or wrong incentives, however you may look at it,
100%.
right? Like, so this is a like the symptom of that. I would say it's not necessarily negative, because it also brings in a lot of capital to the space, which gives the builders enough runway to kind of build all this. Otherwise we would have been the AI winters for a long time, right? Like, so it's good, but it's if you let the genie out of the bottle, you can't control it, right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily good or bad. It just changes the picture. And so, like, you have a lot of people who get into crypto and they're bringing over knowledge from other eras of the internet, and they expect things to follow in the same way, right? So, another thing that's very common is people expect winner-take-all dynamics here because you've seen them in other parts of the internet. I would be willing to bet my entire life that there would not be any winner-take-all dynamics anywhere in crypto. Again, I'm 7 years into this. There haven't been yet. And the reason for that is that financialization that you talked about. Because now it's not a purely like cost-driven, rational decision about what to use or where to build or what to do. There's a financial aspect to it. People develop affinity to it because they can hold an asset, right? You might have said that something like, why do we need, 20 different L1s with competing standards? Well, they have assets now. Those assets around them, a community has been galvanized, and sometimes those communities are just like retail folks, sometimes they're genuine developers, and those people aren't going away. They now have a financial stake in this that, like, again, most people who were using like Facebook as their advertising platform, they don't own Facebook. And certainly, like, most people who are on Instagram don't own Facebook shares. But definitionally, if you're on Solana, if you're using Solana either as a builder or as a end user, you literally own some amount of Solana to use the thing, and then you might own a much bigger stake of it because you're like, I want this to win. So that completely distorts the dynamics that we're used to. And again, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It's bad for just trying to take Web 2 models and apply them directly to crypto. That dynamic doesn't work anymore because our industry has been much more financialized.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the community piece of it is really interesting. I think people are underestimating how much tokenized attention is actually important, and ultimately the broader adoption of the industry, right, is bringing new users in, new capital. Right, I think NFTs did that in DeFi Summer, did that in their respective cycles. And there's a new meta, right? They're bringing new users that are getting interested for different reasons. So I think a lot of the meme coins and the other things like that are happening right now, especially on Solana, I think are super interesting to bring on new users and get people just generally into the space, right? And I think that's a net positive.
Well, I guess I have a hot take on some of the takes of the panelists itself. So I think like we are in an era of like a modular architecture where fundamentally I see that there is some amount of like decision making where I see that people want to prioritize execution over consensus and settlement. And I guess like Celestia, Eigendia, they are really leading that the market has spoken, and they want the execution layer to be a lot more centralized. They want the TPS to go up, and I guess like Avail, Babylon, we are actually betting on the shared security paradigm where whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's Ethereum, or whether it's a big asset class, they can actually provide the security, and the execution itself could be defined by the app games. So I find like interoperability to me right now is a meme because we need to first work on giving the seamless execution experience to the users. And then once you have like the Arbitrums of the world, once you have like multiple rollups using different use cases, I feel like the shared sequencing and some of these other innovations are going to come in on top of like Eigendia, Avail, Babylon to help create a new class. But I feel like it's going to be execution focused. People are looking for very high TPS.
Yeah, though I would say, that you mentioned about interoperability and like that experience being seamless. If you use some of the apps that have been built with LayerZero, with Hyperlane, with pretty good even better than I would have expected to tell, like if you bring me back a year, I would have told you, it's going to take more time. But somehow that's happened. What has not happened yet is that you can provide, call it like an Ethereum level, a Bitcoin level of security, whilst having the seamless experiences. So different trade-offs have been taken. But on this notion, right, like I think the value question that Hasib was asking on the previous panel is like very relevant. It's, does that drain the value from the blockchains underneath? And maybe to some extent, but in a world where Avail flourishes, that's a world of like 10,000, 100,000, a million rollups. In that world, the distinction between an app and the chain has to become narrower. There's not going to be a million generalizable chains the same way that there's not a million generalizable cloud platforms, right? So I don't think that the blockchains are ISPs. They're cloud platforms. They're data centers. In your world, right, in the one that you're trying to build, the one that we're certainly working towards bringing together, it's the question of like, does blockchain, like if there's going to be so many more of these, do they lose their value capture? Well, it moves to apps because many of these new chains are going to be apps. Of the million new rollups that we're going to have, you can bet your ass probably 95% are not going to try and be generalizable and are going to become like app-specific rollups, and so that question kind of loses its meaning a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the major mental model for today's rollups, for most people for today's rollups, is these are EVM-based rollups, but that's not true. I mean, and that's going to change pretty significantly over the next 6 to 12 months, right? Like, in general, like moving on to that particular topic, right? Like, in a world where you're moving into these probably millions of app specific rollups, let's stick to the hundreds and thousands for now. but these are going to be like, we had Stacker on the on a fireside chat earlier this morning, and they're building out an app specific rollup SDK, and so you can actually write a program in TypeScript and like spin up a apps rollup pretty instantly, for example. And someone, I looked at some of their hackathon projects, and someone really built out like an intent solver rollup, for example. Like a chess game on a rollup, for example, because it's just TypeScript, and like it's easier, more accessible to the web too.
I mean, the pool of TypeScript developers is like gotta
Yeah.
be 30 times larger than the pool
Absolutely.
of Solidity developers.
Absolutely. So in that world where like you have to interface or interoperate with these many apps, or not only chains, right? Like how do you envision that? Like have you been already thinking about it? For example, how do you see this transition happening?
I'll say for us, it's that you have to shift away from trying to operate your think of all interoperability as like connectivity. You have to shift away from a centralized service providing connectivity, meaning like our team has to do everything. Our team has to bring this to you. Our team has to facilitate this. Our team has to be the gatekeeper and also the standard keeper, right? Now, in a small number, if you had like say sub 100 chains, that model is actually like superior. This doing everything in-house, keeping all the standards, it does lend to a much better experience with every single one of those 100. But in this, as you add zeros to the number of chains, it has to shift to a much more self-served, self-hosted kind of model. Like create the framework, give people the tools, they lay down the pipes, and then decide how to connect. The same way, I loved your answer in the other panel, where like the internet is built asynchronously. The internet is hosted in many, many, many different places. There are probably like a number of, there was a post about like the 4 different internets, talking about like the Chinese, the Indian, the US, and the European internets as being like slightly distinct with their, geographical borders. But beyond that, it feels pretty seamless within those. And the way we think that has to happen is let anyone put the tools there that allow that connectivity in similar ways. And then whenever a connection is kind of demanded, cool, like it can be easily opened up. But by simply, so let's say if you put Hyperlane on your chain tomorrow, you're not connected with the other 100 chains that have Hyperlane. You can then say, hey, I want to connect with A, B, C, and D. And a different developer on that same chain might say, you know what, I want to connect with E, F, and G. I don't want to connect with A and B and C. And so that's how we see that coming to the fold and like just augmenting the toolkit to make it easier and easier and easier for the next person.
Yeah, and I can follow up there. Because I think we see this in a slightly different way, but ultimately I think it is rooted in in that distribution and how do we expand to the most broad chains, right? For example, like the early internet, you had expansion. You probably had like 5 different firms that were building out TCP/IP adapters, right? So it was like bootstrapped in that way. But I think cross-chain messaging, the way we see it is when it's on chain, if you have a hack, right, that destroys messaging forever, right? Like it's in the internet early days, you had a bug, and there were bugs, but the ramifications of that on chain are much different. And so how we see that is if you expand through a standard, right, that has the same set of security, is deployed by one entity or a range of entities that have the ability to do that, have the certain security level to do that. And you have to be able to, developers can go to one specific standard on every single chain and know that, hey, this is the tried and true one. The off-chain infrastructure doesn't need to like plug in and call 40 contracts, right? And so when you think about scale, it's almost imperative that you have, hey, this is the uniform standard. This is the specific instructions that I need to interact everywhere, right? And so that's just kind of how we see things at LayerZero. I think John and I generally agree on many different things around consensus and verification, as you were talking about, splitting those two different layers. I think expansion, it's almost like a philosophical thing at that point.
Sure, that's good for us that we have a different view on it.
For sure, 100%.
I guess.
No, this is one thing I sort of want to ask LayerZero on, right? I mean, you have this open token standard. What's happening is, given that you guys are the 800-pound gorilla in the market, projects sort of adhere to that. Now, that's, I think, is a big risk. If you look at how technology has evolved in telecom and other sectors, right? Sometimes an early player with the lead sort of sets a standard, and that sort of blocks innovation. Right, so what's happening now is, I'll tell you, you guys did something on the Lido side, with that wrapping the token, and then there's a community feed. You know how that went down, right?
Yep.
So, and there's this XCRC20, there's alloyed assets from Sunny and all that, right? So one thing that I strongly want to sort of disagree with LayerZero, and I guess it's just not personally. I mean, it's basically when you sort of drive and that with all the three sort of the big guys in the space, right? From a current market perspective, you have XLR, CCIP, LayerZero, right? I mean, you're big, obviously, so therefore you have some advantages. But the thing is, when you try and set a standard, it's a bit like how, if you remember Qualcomm in the early 2000s, right? They sort of had the CDMA standard, and they sort of locked the US market in there. And therefore, US telecom experience sucked till around 2008. It was way behind the rest of the world. And in a traditional market, you have monopolies and all the competition commission, all those various bodies coming in and sort of trying to give the smaller guys a fair playing field. But in Web3, I don't know how that's going to work, right? I mean, you have XCRC20 and some of those efforts by the other players. I don't know where you guys stand in this argument, but I mean...
I hear what you're saying, but sorry, look, maybe I could say things that'll be easier. I don't know how any single entity, company, protocol can operate in a way that they wouldn't try to do exactly what they're trying to do, right? Of course, they would try to put forward a standard that they genuinely believe is the most effective one, and they're going to try and spread it everywhere. And if it spreads everywhere, that's awesome. And of course, it might block some innovation down the line, but the reason it's getting adopted in the first place is because it's probably useful to some people, right? The people who are adopting it, I don't think they're doing it because they looks a very good looking guy, but I don't think that's why, right? They're probably just this is useful to me. And so it's just a market dynamic, and the fact that later it can develop into a more pernicious thing that, might stop innovation. I think that's tough. I think it's just the way that these things work.
I agree. So sorry, just to respond to. So in the traditional world, when Microsoft, right, they sort of started packaging their Internet Explorer into their Intel desktops, the regulators stepped in and said, you can't do that. So who does that in Web3? That's my broad question. I mean,
I guess maybe a different take would be that it's good to benchmark to some business practices in Web 2, but you should not be thinking about Web 3 innovation by looking at the history of Web 2, because if we look in that, then our protocol, Bitcoin staking, there is no example of Bitcoin staking in Web 2, right? And Bitcoin is a proof of work chain. When you say like you're bringing staking to Bitcoin, a majority of people would think, oh, are you trying to convert Bitcoin into a side chain and that becomes a proof of stake? So one aspect, and I'm not trying to put a plug here, is for Web3, sometimes it's important to just put out a benchmark because that actually calibrates the rest of the world in terms of thinking that, okay, there is a framework. And if you look at all these EIP innovations, it's never that, oh, Ethereum knows exactly what the path of Ethereum is going to be, but it's a collective framework where you put it out there. I actually partly agree with your point that if you're opening up a new benchmark or a new framework, please don't tie this framework to your token velocity. So don't say that, okay, LayerZero is putting up with this open innovation framework. By the way, please apply for a LayerZero grant using my LayerZero token, and now I'm creating some kind of like buy pressure. As long as, and I think the crypto ecosystem, whether you look at Celestia, Babylon, pretty much the new protocols, they're very cognizant that the market has become very intelligent. So when you're trying to create like neutral benchmarks to kind of fast track innovation, you should not couple that to token velocity, right? So I guess like that would be a way to think about it.
Yep. And I just want to touch upon the point that you made. I think from when you look at the roots of blockchain in general, right? It's permissionless. Anyone can deploy anything, and at that point, it's like it comes to social consensus, right? Like if we do something, is that going to be verified by the market or not, right? That's not necessarily up to us, nor that we can control it, right? And so when we think about the Lido situation, I think that was really it, right? Like social consensus still would have to adopt that no matter what. But when you think about being a permissionless environment, right, like anyone can deploy anything. And I think that's the roots of why kind of we're all here. And then to your point on the standards, right, like LayerZero, the smart contracts that are involved, they're all open source. They're all audited. Anyone can deploy it. I focus on traditional finance and the enterprise space a little bit more than DeFi. But there's been institutions that have fully deployed the LayerZero protocol with the off-chain stack without our help. And so that's not traditionally how it goes. But all of the code that is to use the actual protocol and like the token standards is all open source, and they're just smart contracts, right? Can always be forked and edited. And so for us, it's like, are they using that standard? We're just putting it out there, and right, it's not gated. Anyone can use it, and at that point, it's like, is it valuable to them? Is it bringing their application value? And so that's really kind of where we sit at it.
Yeah. So and it's kind of like both for Hyperlane and LayerZero. So right now, there's like a massive evolution of rollups on the Bitcoin L2s. And I've been actually getting a lot of feedback about like how these rollups are actually looking at like LayerZero as well as Hyperlane in order to just look at like what you guys have been doing over the last 3 years and kind of like learning for what not to do. So even a framework sometimes gives out a standard, like people would not like to do certain things which failed. They would look at the communication on-chain or on an open portal. So I think having frameworks are actually extremely important, and every big protocol, they actually need to put forward a framework because that really helps you kind of guide the community.
No, for sure. And just the one thing I'll say is I think it would be very difficult to anticipate like a motivated protocol team to not try and embed its standards, right? Like otherwise they're just, you're asking them to do everything to create like the best product that they can, the best experience for people, but don't have too many people using it because it's going to be bad down the line. Like the EVM is the best example of this. Like I think everyone here probably knows it has many, many, many limitations. Half of our products here are born out of those same limitations. It's not the best. It's probably the fact that like it has become the de facto standard, the easiest way to build a chain now, has prevented many forms of innovations. But like we're not going up to Vitalik and saying like, you motherfucker, I can't believe it. Like you've created this thing because of your success. So many people now use this, and now like, you know, alternative VMs that might have some technical superiority barely get the time of day. And so it's this, I think it's just very hard to live in those two things at once of just, hey, go do your best to proliferate this protocol, implement the standard, get many people to adopt it, build around it, and then, but you don't want to take it too far because it'll have all these drawbacks.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just incumbent upon LayerZero to actually make that effort. I guess part of this discussion is again the collective community sort of asking the questions that need to be asked so that there's a balance in the way the thing ecosystem evolves, right? So again, I'm not
Yeah.
laying it on LayerZero just to be clear. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just try to steer the conversation away from the power dynamics in the industry and, like whether we should limit Lido from, taking in more delegations and stuff like that. But so that's a very complicated topic, how to kind of, uh, have a permissionless protocol behave in a certain way, right? Like, so we'll gloss over that for the time being. In general, from a immediate point of view, right? Like, I mean, I just wanted you guys to talk a little bit about what are the groundbreaking things that you've been observing in general in the interoperability space, or things that have been been so good that you've been dying to put them on your roadmap, for example, right? Like, I mean, some examples of that would be pretty illuminating.
I can take it. I think the different services in which you can build on top of each piece of interoperability is pretty interesting, right? I think you have different token standards, so you have fungible tokens. You have an array of different non-fungible tokens that are extremely different, and for different use cases. And I think from the verification piece and the execution, right? It's essentially a marketplace, and I think John would agree in this as well. Is like having those way more modular, where anyone can step in from a marketplace and ultimately have a revenue opportunity if they do it well, right? And so from a verification perspective, anyone can step in. Applications can really just decide who they want to use and who they trust, and that service provider can ultimately make money. And then on the execution piece, right, I think there's a little bit more involved there, but all of us, or I mean, most interops have run some type of a relay or execution piece. And that is, ultimately, those are not, like, you can build services on top of those. And I think there's a lot of surface area in which that either the underlying company that can build with the protocol, or other people can step in and say, hey, there's value here to build on top of this, and we're just going to extend that, right? And I think just from an overall perspective, there's a lot of value accrual things that can be built on top of these interoperable protocols.
You were right. I do agree. I'll say from our part, very excited about the work that y'all are doing in Babylon, that EigenLayer is doing in Ethereum, and being able to leverage that. I'd say, no offense, we love EigenLayer, we work with them a lot, but the one that I'm personally more excited to kind of put on, because we're also going to have the EigenLayer thing done in a few weeks, so it's like not as exciting to talk about, but adding Bitcoin security into the context of, say, a Bitcoin layer 2 that wants to communicate with other chains, like that is very exciting for me. And one way that we could do that is by a more tighter integration with Babylon once it's live. And so once you guys are ready, we'd love to put that on the board.
We're going to go to mainnet in the Q3. So.
Beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah, the one thing that I completely agree with these two gentlemen on the emerging paradigms, but yeah, one thing that we are focusing on at Router is actually building dApps that actually amp up the messaging part, use cross-chain intents, etc. We're working with a few teams that are using Router to sort of solve interesting problems, taking advantage of all the cool emerging cross-chain stuff that all of us have done. And I think while it's equally important to sort of push the barriers from a technical perspective, ultimately you need to have adoption, because right now a lot of bridging is just cross-chain asset transfer, right? Messaging is still going to spike. It will spike, but hopefully over the next few years, we'll have, next few quarters, we'll have good apps that sort of are pretty complex, right? They might use EigenLayer for consensus, or maybe something else for security, something for consensus, and and ultimately are natively cross-chain. Because at the end of the day, if you look at, I love this analogy, right? So just humor me for a minute, Anurag. Before 05, your developer, you had a developer for every stack, the Sun Solaris stack, the Microsoft stack, you had multiple stacks, right? And then if you're an end user, if you're a Word doc that somebody sent you from a MacBook and you're a Microsoft Palm Pilot or something, it's completely messed up, right? Very fragmented user and developer experience, right? And then the one thing that changed all this was the cloud. Right? The cloud happened, and all you needed was Google Doc link or whatever. And then as a developer, you're mostly worried about deploying to the Amazon AWS Docker, whatever provider of your choice. Same way, even with what we're all doing, I mean, at the end of the day, you need to have sort of a unification of these end user and developer experiences. And I think that's what we need to collectively push towards.
I guess like what I'm excited about is like we focus very heavily on the Bitcoin ecosystem, and kind of like the interoperability space is really open to attack, to be honest. And just like a quick example for builders is like the top 3 protocols on the L2 is like Stacks, Thesis, and BOB. Now you go from Bitcoin layer 1 to either of these protocols, you start participating in any of these protocols. Let's say you get some gains. Now you actually have to come down to Bitcoin and then again enter the next one. So fundamentally, the Stacks economy, the BOB economy, and the Thesis economy is completely not speaking to each other. So it seems like because of Hyperlane and LayerZero, these L2s on Bitcoin, they seem to be more confident of using some kind of technology to go to EVMs rather than actually talking to themselves. So yeah, so for that's a great opportunity for like the interoperability layer in the Bitcoin space, because eventually the Bitcoin economy is going to be very fragmented as it stands right now. So anybody who's like trying to attack that space, that's a huge billion-dollar market you can attack.
No disagreement there.
Okay, I think it's just been a pretty intense debate bordering on the political. And so, yeah.
Hot take series. He came with the fire. He brought the fire. It was good. Made it fun.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing the fire and the intensity. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was pleasant talking to you.
Thank you for having us.